Robespierre by S.L. Carson. So this is part of the World Leaders Past and Present series, which is a series of young adult books on famous world leaders. I'm reading them just because I happen to have access to them. They were in the library. I'll link down below to my introductory video on this whole series if anyone is interested. But this particular book is on Robespierre. So Robespierre is a figure I found endlessly fascinating. And for a long time now, I've been wanting to read like a proper biography of Robespierre. I had been searching on Amazon and didn't find anything. I don't know, maybe I'm searching wrong. But if anyone knows of like a good biography in English of Robespierre, let me know. Ideally what I want, if this book is out there, is something in English, something that's written in like an engaging style, like not some sort of dry academic text, but you know, like a bit of a more armchair history or popular history, and something that gets into enough detail to be interesting. You know, like more than just like a survey of the French Revolution. Yeah, I haven't found any biographies like that with my brief search of Amazon. So again, anyone knows anything, let me know. But part of the reason I find Robespierre so fascinating is because he seemed like he was such a good guy up until the point he wasn't. He had such moderate Republican views. They were extreme at the time, I guess, by the standards of like 18th century Europe, but like nowadays he'd just be considered like a classical liberal. You know, he was for democratic reforms, he was for equal rights for everybody, he was for abolishing slavery, he was for staying out of like needless foreign wars, and then he just seemed to have lost his mind at the end and became a tyrant. So like it raises the question, was Robespierre kind of like this wolf in sheep clothing all along? Was like he a bad guy all along who was just waiting for the chance to seize power? Or was he an ideologue and an idealist? And I think the history seems to indicate that he was an idealist who just couldn't handle absolute power. And you know, there are tons of people in history like this, arguably. Lenin, Castro, Mao, Daniel Ortega, Robert Mugabe, and tons of others. Now, like if you're a conservative, then you would argue that, you know, Lenin and Mao were communists, and so they were always evil because they're communist. I mean that's a conservative ideology, right? But Robespierre was not a communist. Robespierre was a Republican, and so you can't play that old communists are always evil argument here. It just seems to be something about absolute power that even when good people have it, it drives them crazy. Or I don't know. I mean, the other thing about Robespierre is I think him and Oliver Cromwell were like the first examples of the idealistic revolutionary who turns into a tyrant. I mean, there have been tons of examples since then in history, but I think they were the first, or at least they're the only ones that spring to mind right now. And if anyone has any other examples that predate Robespierre and Oliver Cromwell, let me know. I can't really think of anything at the moment, although like it strikes me, Chinese history, I don't know a lot of Chinese history, but they're like, I guess there are a lot of examples of peasant rebellions that just turned into new dynasties in Chinese history, right? Like I said, I don't know the details. Let me know in the comments if you know anything. Anyways, it's a little bit Robespierre. I would talk about like the young Robespierre versus the old Robespierre. But Robespierre died when he was only 36, which is, you know, shocking to think about. I'm 5 years older than him when he died now. So I guess you can just talk about maybe the reformer Robespierre versus the tyrant Robespierre. The reformer Robespierre was an opponent of the death penalty who once spent 2 sleepless nights struggling with his responsibility as magistrate to impose the death penalty on a convicted murderer. That's from page 34 of this book. The tyrant Robespierre was the master of terror, who caused 60 to 80 people to die on the guillotine each day during the dreadful summer of 1794, from page 106. Now, unfortunately, this biography, because it's so brief and because it's just kind of meant to be a brief biography, doesn't really get into the psychology of Robespierre. They don't have time. So I didn't really get any interesting answers. I didn't get any answers at all to the question of how did he go from reformer to tyrant. But I did learn a number of interesting little historical tidbits, and I'll share some of those here. For example, I learned that the cases that Robespierre argued, I learned about the cases that Robespierre argued as a young lawyer. Quote, accustomed to living modestly, Robespierre took on cases that allowed him to display his high regard for social virtue and justice. That's from page 33. I also learned that Robespierre started out as a poor public speaker, and at first was constantly overshadowed by Mirabeau. Quote, when Mirabeau entered the chamber, other deputies drew away in disgust, but he nevertheless commanded their attention whenever he spoke. As for Robespierre, however, it was reported that on one occasion he was so flustered that he was forced to leave the rostrum in tears. Mirabeau gave more than 100 speeches from 1789 to 1790. Robespierre managed to give fewer than 30, from page 62. So that's interesting, huh? I think about that sometimes whenever I get on camera and start flubbing my words and stuttering or something like that. I think, well, you know, Robespierre also started out terrible. Of course, Robespierre was only 36 when he died, and I'm 41. So, well, there you go, huh? Anyways, moving on. Unfortunately, the French Revolution, with all its various stages and with all its competing factions, is a lot of information to cram into a small book like this. As a consequence, the book focuses mostly on the stages of the revolution and doesn't go into detail on Robespierre's life at this time. However, the book does note his position on a number of issues. For example, Robespierre argued in the assembly that all citizens, not just property-owning citizens, should have the right to vote. And he eventually won on this point. He persuaded the rest of the assembly. He argued that the French slave trade should be abolished, but he lost this one. He lost out to the strong deputies in favor of the slave trade. Robespierre was unequivocally for freedom of the press. In an effort to prevent power from being established, Robespierre argued that the new legislative assembly should consist of entirely newly elected members, and none of the members of the old Constitute Assembly should be allowed to stand for election. And Robespierre also opposed the war with Austria, correctly cautioning that revolutionary zeal was no substitute for military strength. Although he lost the debate to Brissot at this point, and Brissot ended up having the war with Austria, but Robespierre was right in the end. That war was a disaster. In short, Robespierre appears to be a reasonable man of pure democratic principles. He was considered radical at the time, but by the standards of today, he stands as a moderate classical liberal. And then he begins to lose his mind with power. Unfortunately, because of the brevity of this book, there isn't space to do much more than list Robespierre's positions, with little insight into why he began to harden into a dictator, and almost no information about his personal life. Hopefully someday I'll find I'll be able to find a more in-depth biography. In the meantime, this was a very interesting short book for the amount of time it took to read.